If episode 1 is about unease, episode 2 is about the moment unease becomes action. Because the most disturbing part of the Dyatlov Pass incident is not that 9 people died in harsh winter conditions. Tragically, nature has done that before. The disturbing part is how they behaved before they died. When rescuers eventually found the tent on the slope of Kolatsk Yakul, it was still standing in part, snow-covered, damaged, abandoned, and what they found there immediately made the case feel wrong. The tent had been cut open from the inside. That detail matters. If people leave a tent in a hurry, they normally use the entrance lest something makes the entrance unusable, inaccessible, or too slow. But this looked like a deliberate escape through the fabric itself. Inside, many of their belongings were still there. Boots, cliff, clothing, equipment, items a winter hiker would not willingly abandon in sub-zero temperatures unless staying inside had, in that moment, felt even more dangerous than exposure. That single fact has fueled decades of theories. Avalanche, katabatic wind, military testing, panic response, interpersonal conflict, something seen, something heard. But to understand the emotional weight of it, you have to picture the decision from inside the tent, not from a safe room decades later. From there, from a dark shared shelter on an open slope in the middle of violent cold, something made them choose the snow. Not later, immediately. Investigators later found footprints leading away from the tent, heading downslope toward the forest. That part is strange too, because the tracks suggested that at least some of them did not sprint blindly. They moved in a relatively ordered way. That suggests a terrifying possibility. They were frightened enough to abandon the tent, but not so disorganized that they lost all control. In other words, whatever happened may have felt urgent, but not chaotic in the way a random accident usually does. It may have felt specific, as if the danger was not the mountain in general, but something about remaining in that tent at that moment. The tracks led toward a wooded area roughly a kilometer away. There, under a cedar tree, rescuers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivanish. They had apparently tried to make a fire. That detail is deeply human. It cuts through all the mythology, no matter what frightened them. Once they reached the trees, survival instinct returned. Find shelter, start heat, stay together if possible. Branches on the cedar were broken high up, suggesting that one of them may have climbed the tree, perhaps to look back toward the tent, perhaps to search for others, perhaps in desperation. The 2 Yuris were inadequately dressed for those conditions. Their bodies indicated severe cold exposure. They died there near the remains of that fire, close to one another, in the dark. Between the tree and the tent, 3 more bodies were found later. Igor Dyatlov, Zinada, Kolmogorova, and Rustem. Their positions gave the impression they may have been trying to return to the tent. That detail is heartbreaking because it suggests a sequence. First, leave the tent. Then, reach the forest. Then, realize they cannot survive long without gear. Then, attempt to go back. Igor was found in a way that implied struggle against the cold and terrain. Zinada too. Rustem had injuries including a skull fracture, though not necessarily one that by itself explains the whole event. And then there were the remaining 4, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kalivitov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Semyon. They were found much later, in a ravine under deep snow, and their injuries became the part of the case that pushed it fully into legend. Some of them had severe internal trauma, chest injuries, a major skull fracture. In Ludmila Dubinina's case, devastating damage, including the absence of soft tissue in the mouth area that later fueled sensational retellings for decades. To be clear, not every strange detail needs a supernatural explanation. Bodies in freezing wet, remote conditions can undergo post-mortem changes that sound horrific when stripped of context. Water, scavengers, pressure, delayed recovery, all of these matter. But even after allowing for that, the case remained unsettling because some injuries seemed extreme, while external signs on the body did not always match what people expected from ordinary blunt trauma. Later commentary often described those injuries as comparable to the force seen in car crashes, so naturally the theories multiplied. One explanation is avalanche or slab snow movement. A smaller, localized collapse of snow above the tent may have threatened or partially impacted it. causing the group to cut their way out and descend quickly. That theory has gained support from some modern modeling because it explains why they left the tent and why they may have tried to relocate temporarily. But critics point out that classic avalanche signs were not obvious, and the slope did not appear, at first glance, ideal for a massive avalanche scenario. Still, a slab release does not need to look like a giant cinematic wall of snow to be dangerous. Another theory involves katabatic wind or extreme wind phenomena. These are powerful downhill air movements capable of producing terrifying force and noise. In such conditions, a tent on an exposed slope might become intolerable or genuinely dangerous. That could explain the decision to leave, especially if the group believed the tent might fail completely. Then there is infrasound, the idea that certain wind-terrain interactions can generate low-frequency sound that humans do not consciously hear, like normal sound, but may experience as dread, panic, pressure, or irrational fear. This theory is attractive because it fits the psychological oddness of the case. It offers a mechanism for fear without visible threat. It also fits, at least narratively, with the idea that the wind itself became the trigger. Not a ghost, not a creature, just the mountain using physics in a way the human body interprets as terror. And yet, Evan, when you line up the reasonable explanations, something about the case resists closure, because we still come back to the same question. What made 9 capable people feel that staying inside that tent was no longer possible? Here is one plausible dramatized reconstruction for a horror narration. Not as proven fact, but as the kind of thing that could have happened within the known evidence. Inside the tent, the wind begins to change. Not simply louder, but structurally different. The slope, the snowpack, the tent, tension. The mountain shape, everything combines into a low-pressure acoustic effect that creates pulsing vibrations. Those vibrations do 2 things at once. First, they make the hikers think something external is moving near the tent. Second, they create a mounting physical pressure in their ears, chest tightness, the sense that a threat is present even if not visible. Then there is a shift in snow above or around the tent. Not a huge avalanche, but enough deformation or pressure to make the shelter feel compromised. Now imagine that from inside. The wind already sounds wrong. The air already feels wrong. Someone thinks they heard a voice. Someone else feels the wall of the tent flex inward. Snow dust filters in. A support line strains. The entrance is blocked or too slow to use. At that point, nobody needs a supernatural explanation. They just need 1 second of shared conviction that the tent is no longer safe. Knife out. Fabric cut. Cold detonates into the shelter. They leave fast. That would explain the first impossible decision, but not the rest. Because once they reach the forest, the group appears to have split into smaller survival responses. The fire builders, the returners, the shelter seekers. Under the cedar, the 2 Uris tried to create heat with almost nothing. Their hands would have gone numb quickly, their breathing shallow, their judgment narrowing. Igor, Zenaida, and Rustem may have realized the only real chance to survive was to get back to the tent and retrieve clothing and gear. So they turned uphill into the dark, into wind, into deep snow, trying to retrace their path by memory and instinct. They never made it. The Laxva likely tried something more strategic, a snow shelter, a denser protected point near the ravine. That is a rational move. It suggests they had not given up. But the ravine is where the story becomes physically brutal. Snow bridges can collapse. Hidden drops can injure or bury people. A fall into a ravine under snow pressure could explain the severe trauma in a way that is violent but natural. Not cinematic evil, just bad terrain at the worst possible time. And maybe that is what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident endure, because every explanation is unsatisfying in a different way. If it was avalanche or snow slab, why did it feel so strange? If it was wind, why did it lead to such final consequences? If it was panic, what triggered panic in a group this experienced? If it was all natural, why does every detail still feel 1 inch away from the supernatural? People often want 1 single answer, 1 neat sentence, but the outdoors rarely gives you that. Sometimes, disaster is not 1 event. It is a chain, a wrong route in bad visibility, an exposed campsite, a dangerous acoustic environment, sleep deprivation, mounting stress, a structural threat to the tent, rapid escape, extreme cold, separation, terrain injuries, and then nature finishing what confusion started. That explanation is less dramatic than monsters in the snow. But honestly, it may be worse, because it means the mountain never needed anything supernatural. It only needed conditions. 9 people on a dead white slope, a tent vibrating in the dark. Everyone awake now? Nobody wanting to sound foolish? The wind no longer sounding like weather, a pressure in the chest, a line straining under snow, a sound that resembles a name just closely enough to be heard twice. And then the oldest fear in the world, not knowing whether the threat is outside you or already inside your mind. The Soviet case was eventually closed with language that, in translation, has often been summarized as something like an overwhelming natural force. That phrase explains everything and nothing, because it leaves room for snow, for wind, for fear, for all the invisible pressures nature can apply to a human being in the dark. And in a story like this, that may be the most honest ending. No creature was ever found. No attacker ever emerged from the storm. No final message told us what they saw, heard, or believed in those last hours. Only a ruined camp, footprints in snow, a fire under a cedar, bodies scattered between decision and survival, and a mountain that kept its shape as if nothing unusual had happened there at all, which is, maybe, the coldest part of the story. Because if the wind really did speak that night, it never had to say much, just enough to make them listen.